friends? Welcome to another Pints with Jack Skype session. These are the fun supplemental things that David and I do after we record the podcast episode, where we like to focus on specific things and go into depth, get a little bit more personal, and get a bit off scripted, which, as we all know, David does not love. But anyways, I am joined by my dear friend, David. So David, thanks for joining again and providing your wisdom. So welcome.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. So we just recorded our retrospective episode, which means on the podcast, if you don't follow, we just finished a book, which has taken a few months for us to go through, which means we've digested it, unpacked it. It was wonderful to go through. We had a great time with it. And this is Lewis wrote, we read a quote in the beginning of this episode. It's his best book, he believes. And yet he also admits most don't agree with him. So the author himself thinks it's the best. So we had a great time going through themes. And what I want us to do this week, David, is to talk about a couple themes, a few of the major themes, but then focus on humility. I'll just say it up front, but I won't start unpacking it yet, because that's so much what this is about. We've talked so much about false self, true self, incurvatus, inse, which we'll unpack some of that potentially, but humility is the cure for everything. So anyways, without further ado, David, let's jump in. What would you say was one of your biggest takeaways from this book?
One of my biggest takeaways.
I know when you phrase it that way, it always makes it harder. But that's why I put one of the biggest rather than the biggest.
I think for me it was how easily we can delude ourselves. How we can have a lot of virtue in our life, but still have a real blind spot. One of the back and forths that we've had with listeners is, how much is Orwell to blame? Is she lying? Is she deluded? Where is that boundary? And for people that like Orwell more, they point out that she has a lot of virtue and a lot of very natural virtue, which I think is true. However, we do very clearly see that this girl has a blind spot. And that blind spot is principally around her sister Psyche and her tutor, the fox. And while she can be filled with many different kinds of virtues, she can have a real blind spot for these two, and the good love that she does have for them can very easily become distorted, and even with the most introspection in the world, she doesn't see it.
And do you think that's because, or do you think it's fair to say, on the surface that's due to pride, but then as Henry Nouwen would argue, pride is actually just the mask of self-rejection, hurts and wounds, creating the blind spot?
Yeah, I think you could point to lots of things that helped her form this blind spot. Death of her mother, the unloving nature of her father, her own ugliness, and when that disposition then meets things that are good and beautiful, Psyche, who is the personification of every single virtue, and the fox, who is clearly wise, that she wants to hold on to these things at all costs, even if it means manipulating those things. As long as she gets to hold on to them, she eventually doesn't care.
Yes. So we've talked a lot about false self, true self in this. And people who want to go back to some of our previous Skype sessions or even blog posts, that's been a huge theme. Probably I've beaten a dead horse. Was it dead cow, dead horse, dead calf?
It's a horse.
There we go, dead horse.
I think you could have beaten a cow as well. But.
I have, though, because that's just a big theme in this. And we've talked even about recently in a Skype session that the true self isn't always good. It's sometimes ugly, messy. And you've confirmed that Lewis believed this in a quote, which I thought was so cool. So that to me is a big theme. We don't need to unpack that she had this false self and that she needed to unwind this. And it was her wounds that caused her to honestly put on this false self, to earn love, to need validation, to devour people. But what stuck out to me was the role of humility. And honestly, I didn't catch it quite as much as you did, and you talked about on a couple episodes, and your interview with Andrew Lazo. The false self is driven in great part by pride, I believe, the ego. It's the ego drives a lot of it. And humility is honestly the antidote, the cure to the ego.
Antidote.
Antidote, yes. It's like, I know my apostate. I don't even know which one is the right and wrong
You
one
know
anymore.
your prostate, yes.
I've not gotten to that yet. But you have this false self you built up out of your ego, and it constantly needs to be validated by the world. It uses people for its own ends. Incurvatus inse. We see glimpses of Lewis arguing the role of humility throughout this. You mentioned that one of the scenes in the book of Orwell actually being able to perceive God's love, or the love of the gods towards her, briefly, was when she was on her knees. Very symbolic. Lewis probably wasn't accidental or coincidental with that. He was very intentional with that choice. When she gets on her knees, you talked about with Andrew Lazo at the end, the role of humility, where she learns she is no longer the answer. I like how he says, I am in the beginning of part 1 and no answer at the end. And he combines those, I am no answer. And at the end of part 2 says, you are the answer, God. And the role that humility plays in turning us outward and forgetting about ourselves. And this was a huge theme for Lewis. That was really, I want to use the word revelatory, because we all know pride caused the fall, humility caused the reascent, but those are very abstract ideas. But when you see someone completely turned within themselves and how they devour people, to then realize the role that humility plays to undoing that, that's powerful in my mind. So that was a big thing for me. But how did that connect with you?
Well, when you said there, I am no answer, and not looking to yourself, Lewis spells it out very clearly in Mere Christianity. Look to yourself, and all you'll find is, and he lists off all of these terrible things. He says, but look to Christ, and everything then becomes very, very different. And Orwell has spent the entire book looking to herself and to created things. It's only when her gaze is raised upwards, because with pride you can only look down. With humility you're actually then able to look upwards. Then everything begins to change when you look at the source of all of these things, of the thing that is immeasurably greater than you, i.e. God.
And I was really recognizing, as I was thinking about all of this, I was recognizing how little humility I have. So the natural next question for me was, well, Matt, what can you do? Obviously, first and foremost, pray for that grace from our Heavenly Father. Pray that He can provide that humility. Not that He can, He will. Pray that your heart is opened up to receiving it. He will give you it. But there are, in a very Lewis fashion, there are practical steps you can do. And it's not like Lewis gives these. But I was just thinking, what are small things you can do in your life that stop you from turning within? So as we record this will probably be released. The market could be at all-time highs again. But right now, market's in chaos, up and down. We're not really sure what's going on. And I'm so absorbed with that because my livelihood, it's my job, it's what I do. And so I'm very turned within right now. And I know that and I can see that. So this is very acute to me in this moment. There's a couple people in the office space that I work in that gentleman loves to chat. I'm just like, all right, dude, stop talking. I need to get back to work. And it's terrible of me though, because it's all about me. And I'm very self-centered right now because of what's going on and things that are just because of the nature of the markets. And I was thinking to myself, Matt, you need to do small gestures of, you know what, this half hour, this conversation's doing nothing for you. That's okay. In fact, you need to do that because you need to stop thinking about yourself. And so that's how I've been processing all of this humility of what things am I doing in my life that aren't soothing my anxiety or feeding my ambitions or whatever it is. They're all I-centered. What am I doing that's just for the other? And you have to be careful there too, because you can be like, Matt, well, that's you also trying to think of how can I become humble, which also is self-centered to some degree. But that's how I've been thinking a lot about this of recent.
Yeah, well, I mean, Lewis, I think he would tell you to just try and forget about yourself. And I would suggest that it's easier to forget about yourself when you spend more time thinking about other people. So one of the things I've been encouraging everyone I know to do is to reach out to people that you haven't spoken to in a while. Not necessarily your close friends who you don't get to now spend as much time with, but while we're all on lockdown, reach out to that friend that you haven't seen in a couple of years and just see how they're doing.
I'm not even doing that well. I'm looking at this lockdown as legalization of Matt's introvertedness to say no to everyone so I can focus on my work.
Yeah, no, you can't come around. It's the law.
It's terrible, though. That is what's happening. And probably why my love language is quality time, because I don't give up time very much.
Well, next season we're going to be looking at the Screwtape Letters, and Screwtape has a lot to say about the word mine and about how silly it is when humans use it. And he particularly tells Wormwood, if your man is that sort of a man, let him think that the 24 hours are rightfully his, and therefore anyone who takes anything away from that is unjustly stealing something that truly belongs to him.
Ooh, you just described me, which is why
I just described myself. I hate that part of the Screwtape Letters.
Oh, that has literally destroyed my life. If you looked at my calendar, it is mapped out. Even my time with God is my time with God. It's mapped in there.
Not God's time with me.
No. It's adoration, 5:30 to 6. Right in there. Daily mass, rosary time. It's all scheduled. And if something comes up that shifts that, I don't throw it somewhere else. It's like, well, that was my time for you, and it's gone. So Matt has something to learn. But anyways, to bring this full circle, to wrap this up, we've talked a lot about the false self. If you've been watching these Skype sessions, we've talked a lot about that ego side of us. Incurvatus in se, David's favorite turn. You want the antidote to that. Now you've got me self-conscious, David. You want the antidote to that. It is genuinely humility. And we know humility is thinking of yourself less. And that just means thinking of the other, turning yourself out. Think of how you're spending your time. Think of is everything meant to be feeding you, or there's some things that are just for the other. And that is a big thing as we wrap up till we have faces. That's how you're able to see the gods. That's Lucy in the Chronicles of Narnia. And it's a powerful theme that Lewis brought full circle. And I'm glad we're able to talk about it here today in today's Skype session.
And I would suggest anybody that wants to take a course in pride, or maybe humility, go and look in book 3 of Mere Christianity. It's where Lewis really unpacks the insidious nature of pride and pretty much how it ruins everything. In Mere Christianity, he says, the Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began.
I was debating how vulnerable I get. I'm going to choose not to be super vulnerable. But when I read that chapter, because of time's sake, and, well, I just don't feel like it. When I read that chapter, there was certain things in my life, certain sins I was working on getting rid of, certain brokenness in my heart. And I remember reading that chapter, and I actually wrote, if you look at my copy of Mere Christianity, it has the F-bomb like 3 or 4 times. I was a little more vulgar back then. This was 2011. And I was like, that is me. I was correcting these sins out of pride, because I actually said to myself, I think he says that in Mere Christianity, I shouldn't do that because I'm better than that. And I was like, shoot. and he actually argues Satan has still got you after you've gotten over that sin for the wrong reason. And I was like, oh, maybe I should just go back to the sin. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll end this with the final couple of sentences from that chapter.
All right, let's do it.
Because Lewis gives his suggestion. He says, if anyone would like to acquire humility, I can, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you're very conceited indeed.
Well, I've got that going for me. I know I'm quite conceited. David, thank you, and cheers, my friend.
Cheers.